The Nevada sun hammered down like molten copper as Marshall Wade guided his dust-covered gelding toward Silver Creek Station. At 34, he bore the weathered appearance of a man who had spent a decade running from ghosts that refused to stay buried. The silver deputy's badge he'd once worn with such conviction now lay wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of his saddlebags, a relic of dreams that violence had long since shattered. His horse's hooves struck the sun-warped planks of the platform with hollow echoes that seemed to mock the emptiness in his chest. 3 days of riding through desert winds that could strip paint from a barn had left both man and beast parched beyond endurance. The canteen at his side held barely a swallow of warm, brackish water, and the promise of the station's well had drawn him here like a moth to flame. The afternoon heat shimmered off the wooden buildings in waves that made the horizon dance like water. Sweat had long since soaked through Marshall's shirt, leaving salt stains on the faded blue cotton that marked him as another saddle tramp, drifting between nowhere and nothing. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Ranger, stood with its head hanging low foam, flecking its muzzle, despite the careful pace Marshall had maintained across the wasteland. The station buzzed with the usual collection of westbound travelers, well-dressed passengers from eastern cities, mixing uneasily with local ranchers, miners, and drifters. A portly businessman in a striped suit consulted his gold pocket watch with obvious agitation, while his wife, resplendent in an elaborate bustle dress, fanned herself beneath a lace parasol. Her complaints about the dreadful heat and primitive conditions carried clearly across the platform, drawing tolerant smiles from the weather-beaten locals who had long since learned to endure what they could not change. 2 young cowboys lounged against a freight wagon, their spurs jingling softly as they shifted position to follow the movements of a pretty girl in gingham who was traveling with her parents. An elderly prospector sat on a wooden bench, methodically cleaning his fingernails with a knife, while keeping one eye on the approaching train that would carry him deeper into the territories. The usual collection of humanity that gathered at such crossroads, each carrying their own hopes and disappointments toward uncertain destinations. Marshall had reached for his canteen, anticipating the bitter disappointment of finding it empty, when a child's anguished cry split the desert air like the crack of a bullwhip. The sound drove through him with startling precision, awakening instincts he'd tried to bury, along with his badge and his beliefs about justice. His head snapped toward the platform where stationmaster Jeremiah Briggs stood over a small wheelchair, like a buzzard contemplating its next meal. Briggs was a man approaching 60, his graying beard meticulously trimmed, and his railroad uniform pressed to military precision despite the oppressive heat. His silver badge caught the sunlight as he moved, and his boots were polished to a mirror shine that spoke of obsessive attention to detail. But his eyes held the desperate gleam of someone balanced on the knife's edge of disaster, and his hands trembled slightly as they gripped the wheelchair's wooden handles with white-knuckled intensity. "I told you to clear off my platform, you miserable burden." Briggs snarled, his voice cracking with barely controlled hysteria. Spittle flew from his lips as he spoke, and the veins in his neck stood out like cords. The wheelchair's occupant was a boy of perhaps 10 years, his thin frame drowning in clothes that had been mended too many times to count. His pants were held up by suspenders that had been knotted where they'd broken, and his shirt bore patches of different colors that spoke of careful but poverty-stricken maintenance. His legs hung motionless beneath a patched woolen blanket, clearly useless from birth or injury, but his eyes blazed with intelligence and a quiet dignity that made Marshall's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. The boy's face was gaunt with hunger, his cheekbones too prominent for a child his age, and his hands showed the telltale signs of someone who had learned to rely entirely on his arms for mobility. But despite his obvious physical limitations and current distress, there was something unbroken in his expression, a core of strength that reminded Marshall of someone he couldn't quite place. "Please, mister," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible above the station's noise. The words carried the careful pronunciation of someone who had been taught proper speech despite humble circumstances. "My mama said to wait here. She said someone would come for me, someone who would understand. Your mama was a fool and so are you." Briggs roared, and with a grunt of effort that spoke more of rage than physical exertion, he shoved the wheelchair forward with vicious force. The chair tilted beyond recovery, its wooden wheels scraping against the platform's rough planks before losing purchase entirely. The boy fell forward helplessly, his small hands reaching out desperately to break his fall, but finding only empty air. He struck the platform hard, the impact driving the breath from his lungs and tearing his patched shirt on a protruding nail. Blood welled from scrapes on his pale cheek and elbow, mixing with the dust and sweat to create muddy streaks on his skin. The boy lay there, gasping tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on his face as he struggled to push himself upright, with arms that shook from exhaustion and fear. His useless legs dragged behind him as he tried to crawl away from Briggs's boots, but his strength was nearly spent from what appeared to be days of neglect and hunger. The reaction from the gathered passengers revealed the moral fault lines that divided frontier society like geological fractures. The businessman in the striped suit stepped back as if the boy's condition might be contagious, his face twisting with disgust as he muttered about undesirable elements cluttering public spaces. His wife nodded approvingly, clutching her silk purse closer to her chest and steering their own well-fed children away from the disturbing scene. "Disgusting," she declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. Such people should be kept in institutions not allowed to offend decent travelers. Why, the very sight is enough to give one nightmares. But not everyone shared their callous indifference. An elderly rancher named Frank Sullivan pushed forward, his weathered face creased with outrage, and his work-hardened hands clenched into fists. "That ain't right, Briggs." He growled, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades earning respect through honest labor. "Boy's just a child, for Christ's sake. Mind your own affairs, Sullivan," snapped a younger passenger wearing the dusty clothes of a traveling salesman and the superior expression of someone who measured human worth in terms of profit margins. "Stationmaster's got legal authority here. Railroad company pays his salary to maintain order, not coddle every beggar who wanders in. Authority to brutalize children." Sullivan's wife, Martha, stepped forward, her maternal instincts overriding the social caution that normally kept frontier women from interfering in men's business. "That boy needs help, not punishment. Any fool can see he's been abandoned and starving." A railroad worker loading freight nearby paused in his labor setting down a heavy crate to watch the confrontation unfold. The man's name was Pete Morrison, and he'd worked for the railroad long enough to witness Briggs's petty tyrannies firsthand. He caught Marshall's eye with a meaningful look, his slight nod suggesting he'd testify truthfully if anyone had the backbone to challenge the stationmaster's authority. Several other passengers began murmuring among themselves, their conversations creating an undercurrent of unease that suggested the moral balance was shifting. A young mother pulled her own child closer, whispering reassurances while shooting daggers at Briggs with her eyes. Two miners who had been playing cards paused their game to watch their faces hard with the particular anger that working men reserved for those who abused the powerless. But it was a small girl clinging to her mother's skirts who voiced what Marshall was thinking. Her child's honesty cutting through the adult complications like a knife through fog. "Mama, why is that mean man hurting the boy? Can't somebody stop him? Doesn't anybody care?" "Hush, Sarah," her mother whispered, pulling the child closer while her own eyes filled with tears of helpless sympathy. "It's not our place to interfere with railroad business. We're just passengers here." Marshall felt his hand drift toward the Colt .45 at his hip, as memories of another time, another badge stirred unwillingly to life. For a decade, he'd told himself that other people's troubles weren't his concern, that getting involved only led to heartbreak and early graves. The world was full of injustice, and one man couldn't fix it all without destroying himself in the process. But watching this child's suffering struck something deep in his soul that all the whiskey and wandering hadn't been able to kill. Maybe it was the boy's dignity in the face of cruelty, or the way he'd spoken of his mother with such trust, or simply the fundamental wrongness of a grown man, brutalizing someone who couldn't fight back. Whatever the reason, Marshall felt the old fire kindling in his chest, the same righteous anger that had once made him a feared and respected lawman. The truth was that Marshall Wade had once been Sheriff Wade of Copper Falls, Colorado, a silver boomtown nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, where he tried to build something lasting with a remarkable woman named Eliza Hartwell. Those golden months seemed like another man's memories, now distant and painful, as old wounds touched by winter cold, but they had been real once. More real than anything in his life, before or since. Eliza had been the town's schoolteacher, a gentle soul from Boston, who'd traveled west to educate miners' children in a one-room schoolhouse that doubled as the community center on Sundays. She possessed an inner light that seemed to illuminate everything around her, and her presence had made Marshall believe that even a man scarred by violence could deserve happiness. Their courtship had been tentative at first. She, the educated lady from the East, he, the rough-hewn lawman whose past was written in scars and calluses, but love had bridged those differences with surprising ease. Their evenings together in the small cabin he'd built on the edge of town had been filled with her laughter as she read aloud from books of poetry and philosophy, while he played guitar by the fireplace. She'd taught him about art and literature, things he'd never had time to appreciate during his hard scramble from poverty to respectability. He'd shown her the wild beauty of the mountains, taking her on horseback rides through meadows filled with wildflowers that made her eyes shine with wonder. They'd talked of marriage, of children, of building a legacy that would outlast the silver mines and bring true civilization to the untamed frontier. Marshall had even begun construction on a larger house, complete with a white picket fence and a garden, where Eliza could grow the roses she'd loved back in Boston. For 6 precious months, he'd tasted what it meant to have a real home and someone to come back to at the end of each dangerous day. But Marshall's unwavering commitment to justice had made him dangerous enemies among the corrupt mine owners and their hired thugs. Samuel Caldwell owned the 3 largest silver claims in the territory and had built his empire on intimidation, claim jumping, and the occasional permanent disappearance of miners who refused to sell their stakes at prices that amounted to robbery. When Marshall began investigating a series of suspicious accidents and unexplained deaths, Caldwell's warnings grew increasingly direct and threatening. The mining kingpin had visited Marshall's office one afternoon, his expensive clothes and cultured speech barely concealing the menace beneath. "Sheriff," he'd said with oily politeness, "a man in your position should understand that some situations are better left uninvestigated. Accidents happen in dangerous work like mining. Questions about such matters can themselves prove hazardous to one's health." Marshall had met the threat with steel in his voice and his hand resting on his gun butt. "Mr. Caldwell, my job is to investigate suspicious deaths, not ignore them. If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear from my questions." Caldwell's mask had slipped, then revealing the cold-blooded killer beneath the gentleman's facade. "Everyone has something to hide, Sheriff, even you. I'd hate to see harm come to that pretty schoolteacher of yours because you couldn't learn when to mind your own business." The memory of that conversation still made Marshall's blood boil even after all these years. He doubled his vigilance after that, varying his routes home and keeping his gun loaded at all times. But he'd underestimated Caldwell's patience and ruthlessness, assuming the man would come for him directly rather than orchestrating the elaborate trap that eventually snared him. The ambush came on a cold October evening as Marshall walked home from the jail after reviewing testimony in a murder trial against one of Caldwell's foremen. 3 masked gunmen had been waiting in the alley behind Morrison's general store, their shotguns loaded with enough buckshot to tear a man apart. They'd given him no chance to surrender, no opportunity to draw his weapon, just opened fire the moment he stepped into their trap. Only luck and the thick leather coat he'd been wearing had kept the first blast from killing him outright. Even so, the buckshot had torn through his chest and shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground in a spreading pool of his own blood. The second shot had been aimed at his head, but he'd managed to roll behind a water trough just in time, the heavy slug gouging chunks from the wooden barrel instead of his skull. The third gunman had moved in for the killing shot. But Doc Patterson had chosen that moment to stumble out of the saloon next door, drunk as a lord, but coherent enough to start shouting about murder. The assassins had fled rather than risk being identified, leaving Marshall bleeding in the alley with wounds that should have killed him. For 3 weeks, he drifted between life and death, while Eliza sat beside his bed in Doc Patterson's back room, holding his hand and whispering prayers into the darkness. He remembered fragments of those delirium-filled days, her tears falling on his fevered brow, her voice singing the lullabies she'd learned as a child, her promises that everything would be all right if he'd just hold on and fight. When he'd finally opened his eyes and reached for her hand, expecting to find her fingers intertwined with his, as they had been throughout his long recovery, he'd found only emptiness and a letter, written in her careful script. The words were burned into his memory with the permanence of brands. My dearest Marshall, I cannot live with the constant fear of losing you to violence. Every day I watch you walk out that door, I die a little more inside knowing that evil men are planning your death. I love you more than life itself, but I cannot bear to become a widow before I've even been a wife. Please don't try to find me. This breaks my heart into 1,000 pieces, but it's the only way either of us can survive what's coming. The letter had shattered something fundamental inside him, leaving him hollow and bitter in ways that his physical wounds had never managed. He'd believed she'd abandoned him from fear or lost affection, unable to handle the dangers that came with loving a frontier lawman. The betrayal had cut deeper than any bullet, carving away his faith in love and loyalty, and leaving only cynicism in its place. Within days of recovering enough to travel, he'd resigned his badge and sold his property for whatever he could get. The house they'd planned to share, the garden where she was going to grow roses, the future they'd built in whispered conversations by the fireplace, all of it had been abandoned to creditors and time. He'd ridden out of Copper Falls forever, choosing the empty road over the risk of caring about anyone or anything again. For 10 long years he'd drifted from town to town like smoke on the wind, taking jobs that required his skills with a gun, but never staying long enough to form attachments that might lead to more heartbreak. He'd become exactly what he thought Eliza had feared, a man with nothing to lose and no reason to care whether he lived or died. Now, watching this boy's suffering, Marshall felt those old protective instincts stirring like coals touched by wind. His hand found his gun before conscious thought intervened, the familiar weight of the Colt .45, as comforting as an old friend's handshake. The weapon cleared leather with the smooth precision of long practice, and he fired a warning shot into the clear desert sky. The crack echoed across the platform like Judgment Day, silencing every conversation as passengers turned to stare at the stranger with death in his eyes and the unmistakable bearing of a man who had worn a badge with distinction. Next shot won't be a warning, Marshall said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had enforced justice in places where civilization was still a fragile dream, balanced on the edge of chaos. Stationmaster Briggs whirled around his face, flushing red with rage, and something deeper, the desperate terror of a man whose entire world was about to collapse around his ears. What Marshall didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Briggs had received a telegram that morning that had turned his blood to ice water and his bowels to liquid fear. Judge Harlan Morrison, the territorial circuit judge with the power to make or break careers throughout the Western Railroad system, wasn't just coming to Silver Creek on routine business. Morrison had a personal grudge against Briggs, dating back to a land dispute that had cost the judge's younger brother his ranch and ultimately his life. The dispute had been over a right-of-way that Briggs had sold to a competing railroad, knowing full well that it would bankrupt the Morrison family's cattle operation. The telegram had been brutally explicit in its implications, though couched in the formal language of official correspondence. Stationmaster Briggs Judge Morrison will arrive, Silver Creek Station 1600 hours today, for inspection. Any irregularity, any sign of poor management, any excuse at all, will result in immediate termination and permanent blacklisting from railroad employment. Signed, Regional Supervisor Hayes. 20 years of faithful service, a pension that would keep his wife and children comfortable in their old age, respectability in a community where railroad employment was as good as aristocracy. All of it balanced on the razor's edge of one man's inspection. And now, this crippled beggar was threatening to destroy everything with his presence on the platform. "You don't understand." Briggs screamed, his composure cracking like ice in spring thaw. Sweat poured down his face, despite the shade of the station's overhang, and his hands shook so violently that his badge rattled against the brass buttons of his uniform. "Morrison arrives in less than 2 hours. If he sees this beggar cluttering my station, I'm finished. 20 years of service gone. My wife, my children, will have nothing." Nothing. The stationmaster's hands shook as he pointed at Thomas with genuine terror, replacing the mere irritation that had initially motivated his cruelty. "That boy's been here 3 days with no ticket, no guardian, no explanation for his presence. Some traveler in a covered wagon dumped him like unwanted baggage and disappeared without so much as a forwarding address. I won't let my family starve because of one crippled beggar who has no business being here." Marshall studied the trembling boy still lying in the dust where he'd fallen, noting how the child's eyes tracked every movement with sharp intelligence, despite his obvious pain and exhaustion. There was something about those brown eyes that tugged at a memory he couldn't quite grasp, a sense of familiarity that made his chest tighten with emotions he'd thought long dead. The boy's face was gaunt with hunger, his cheekbones too prominent for someone his age, and his clothes hung loose on his thin frame. But despite his obvious suffering, he bore his pain with a dignity that reminded Marshall of someone important, someone whose memory stirred feelings he'd tried to bury, along with his badge and his dreams of a different life. "So your solution is brutality against a helpless child?" Marshall asked, his gun still trained on Briggs, but his voice carrying more understanding than condemnation. He'd seen desperation drive good men to do terrible things, and while he couldn't excuse Briggs's actions, he could at least comprehend the fear that motivated them. "My solution is survival." Briggs replied, some of his composure returning now that he'd voiced his terror aloud. "That boy can't work, can't pay his way, can't contribute anything to civilized society. He's dead weight, a burden that decent people shouldn't have to bear. I won't let dead weight destroy my family's future for the sake of misplaced sentiment." The casual dismissal of the child's worth as a human being made Marshall's trigger finger itch with remembered fury. He'd heard similar arguments from mine owners who worked men to death for profit from cattle barons, who murdered homesteaders for their land from every variety of predator, who justified their cruelty through appeals to practicality and economic necessity. "That makes you worse than any outlaw I ever hunted," Marshall said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "At least road agents are honest about their greed. You dress yours up in respectability and call it duty." Briggs's face twisted with rage at the public humiliation, his reputation for competence and authority crumbling before 20 witnesses who would spread word of his shame throughout the territory. With Judge Morrison's arrival looming like a death sentence, and his career already hanging by a thread, he was a man with nothing left to lose. "I won't be lectured by some saddle tramp." Briggs snarled his hand, flying to the Remington pistol at his hip. The weapon cleared leather with surprising speed for a man his age, desperation lending strength to movements that should have been slowed by fear and trembling. The barrel swung toward Marshall's chest with deadly intent. Passengers screamed and scattered like startled quail, diving behind luggage carts and freight wagons in their haste to avoid the gunplay that seemed inevitable. The woman in the elaborate dress knocked over a small child in her panic, while the businessman shoved his own wife aside to reach cover first. The elderly rancher started forward as if to help, but his wife grabbed his arm and pulled him back behind a water barrel. "Frank, don't be a fool." Martha Sullivan hissed, her weathered face pale with fear. "You've got grandchildren who need you alive. This isn't your fight." The metallic click of Briggs's hammer being cocked seemed loud as thunder in the sudden silence that followed the initial chaos. Marshall's hand twitched toward his own weapon, years of training and instinct demanding that he respond to the threat with overwhelming violence. But his eyes were fixed on the boy cowering just feet away from the potential crossfire. And he knew that any traditional gunfight might catch the child in its deadly embrace. Instead of drawing his gun in a motion that would have ended Briggs' life in the space of a heartbeat, Marshall made a desperate gamble that went against every tactical principle he'd learned during his years as a lawman. He dove not toward cover or at his opponent, but toward the boy scooping the small body into his arms just as the stationmaster's gun roared like thunder. The bullet splintered wood where Marshall had been standing, sending sharp fragments flying like shrapnel and embedding splinters in the freight wagons behind him. He rolled behind a stack of crates marked Territorial Supply Company, cradling the trembling child against his chest while using his own body as a shield against further gunfire. The boy's weight was negligible, perhaps 60 pounds of skin and bones that spoke of prolonged hunger and neglect. But Marshall could feel the rapid flutter of a terrified heart, beating against his ribs like a trapped bird. Those familiar brown eyes stared up at him with a mixture of fear and dawning hope that made his chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. "Easy, son," Marshall whispered, grabbing the broken wheelchair frame with his free hand to use as additional cover. The wooden spokes were shattered from Briggs's earlier violence, but the metal fittings might deflect a bullet if luck favored them. "I've got you now. You're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." Briggs fired again and again, his shots wild with rage and desperation, as he emptied his cylinder at the stack of crates. One bullet punched through the wooden planks, inches from Marshall's head. Another struck the wheelchair frame and sent metal fragments spinning through the air. The stationmaster was beyond reason now consumed by the knowledge that his career was finished regardless of the outcome, and determined to take his tormentors down with him. Marshall counted the shots 5, 6, and then the telltale click of a hammer falling on an empty chamber. He waited for the pause that would come as Briggs reloaded, then rose from cover with his Colt in hand, taking careful aim at the stationmaster's gun arm. The bullet took Briggs through the shoulder with surgical precision, spinning him around and sending his pistol clattering across the wooden planks as he clutched his wounded arm and fell writhing in the dust. Marshall had aimed to disable rather than kill, drawing on years of experience, to place his shot exactly where it would end the threat without taking a life unnecessarily. Sudden silence fell over the platform, broken only by Briggs' moans and the distant whistle of an approaching freight train that would complicate their situation immensely if more lawmen were aboard. Marshall approached the fallen man cautiously, his gun still drawn and ready, then kicked the Remington well out of reach before holstering his own weapon. "Should have left the boy alone," Marshall said quietly, his voice carrying more sadness than satisfaction. He'd taken no pleasure in shooting Briggs, understanding that desperation and fear had driven the man to actions that his better nature would normally have rejected. With the immediate threat neutralized, Marshall turned his full attention to the child still huddled behind the freight crates. The boy's shirt was torn and bloody, his cheeks scraped raw from the fall, but his eyes remained alert and focused despite the trauma he'd endured. Marshall knelt beside him, his hands gentle as he examined the injuries with the practiced eye of someone who had treated many wounds over the years. "Let me take a look at those cuts," Marshall said softly, using his bandana to clean the worst of the scrapes with water from his canteen. The liquid was precious in this desert heat, but the boy's needs took precedence over his own comfort. "Nothing too serious here, but they need proper tending to prevent infection." The boy endured the treatment without complaint, though Marshall could see tears gathering in those familiar brown eyes, not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of finally finding someone who cared about his welfare. It was only when they were relatively alone together, with the other passengers keeping their distance, and Briggs' moans growing weaker, that the child found his voice. "Mr. He whispered his small hand, reaching into the torn pocket of his shirt, with movements that spoke of careful deliberation. My mama told me to give this to a man named Wade if I ever found him. She said he'd know what it meant, and that he'd take care of me the way she couldn't anymore. Marshall's world stopped spinning on its axis as the boy produced a silver locket on a thin chain, and the metal tarnished with age, but still beautiful in its careful craftsmanship. Even through the patina of years, he could make out the delicate scrollwork that framed the edges, and in the center, etched with loving precision, a single name that hit him like a physical blow: Wade. His hands shook uncontrollably as he took the locket, his fingers barely able to manage the tiny clasp as he opened it with the reverence of someone handling a religious relic. When the two halves separated, he found himself staring into the face of his lost dreams, his abandoned hopes, his one great love, who had shaped his heart and then broken it into fragments that had never properly healed. Eliza smiled back at him from the faded photograph, exactly as she had looked in their cabin by lamplight 10 years ago. The same soft brown eyes that had gazed at him with such devotion, the same gentle smile that had made him believe he could be worthy of happiness, the same face that had haunted his dreams through a decade of lonely wandering across the empty spaces of the West. "Where did you get this?" Marshall's voice cracked like a boy's, experiencing the change from childhood to manhood, his composure shattered by the impossible appearance of a relic from the life he'd tried so hard to forget. "My mama gave it to me before she died last month," the child said with a heartbreaking simplicity that only children could achieve when discussing matters of life and death. His small fingers traced the outline of the locket as he spoke, the gesture suggesting it had been a source of comfort during his recent ordeal. "She told me to find a man named Wade and tell him I'm his son. She said you'd understand when you saw her picture and that you'd know why she had to leave you all those years ago." The revelation hit Marshall like a lightning strike in a clear sky, illuminating a decade of bitter darkness with the searing light of truth. His vision blurred as understanding crashed over him like a flash flood, rewriting everything he'd believed about love and loss and the woman who had shaped his heart only to seemingly abandon it to despair. "Your mother's name?" he whispered, though he already knew the answer with the certainty that comes from having one's world turned inside out by a single moment of clarity. "Eliza," the boy replied, his small hand reaching up to touch Marshall's cheek, where tears were beginning to cut tracks through the dust and grime of his long journey. "Eliza Wade," and she said, though most folks knew her as Miss Hartwell when she taught school. She said that was her real name, the one she was born to carry, and that someday when I found you, we'd all have the same name like proper families do. Marshall's knees nearly buckled as the full magnitude of the truth settled over him like a physical weight. She hadn't abandoned him from fear or lost love. She'd been protecting their child, his son, from enemies who would have used the boy as a weapon against him. The sacrifice she'd made, the pain she'd endured, the lonely years of raising their child alone, while he wandered the territories nursing his wounded pride, all of it was revealed in the space of a heartbeat. Suddenly, those final days before the ambush made terrible sense, puzzle pieces clicking into place with devastating clarity. Eliza's unusual quietness, her hand often pressed protectively to her stomach, her attempts to tell him something important that never quite found words. She'd been carrying his child and hadn't known how to reveal it, probably waiting for the right moment that Caldwell's violence had stolen away forever. She said the bad men who shot you were still hunting for ways to hurt you. The boy continued, unaware of the emotional earthquake he'd triggered in his father's soul. She was scared they'd find out about me and use me to make you do things that went against your nature. So she ran away to keep me safe. Even though it broke her heart into so many pieces, she never found them all again. Marshall remembered now, with devastating clarity, how Eliza had looked that last morning before the ambush, pale, and drawn her eyes red from crying through the night, her hands shaking as she served him breakfast. He'd attributed her distress to worry about the upcoming trial against Caldwell's foreman, never suspecting she was wrestling with an impossible choice between her love for him and her need to protect their unborn child. She must have written that farewell letter through tears of anguish, knowing she was condemning herself to a life of lonely exile, while letting him believe she'd stopped loving him. The generosity of her sacrifice, the depth of her love, even in apparent betrayal, humbled him beyond words and filled him with shame for the bitter thoughts he'd harbored about her supposed abandonment. "What's your name, son?" Marshall asked, his voice thick with emotion as he pulled the boy closer, feeling pieces of his shattered heart beginning to fit back together after 10 years of bitter wandering. "Oh, Thomas," the boy replied with a shy smile that transformed his thin face and made him look less like a victim and more like the child he should have been allowed to be. "Thomas Wade. Mama said that was your name too, and that someday when I found you, I'd be proud to carry it because you were the bravest and most honorable man she'd ever known." Marshall pulled his son close, overwhelmed by the miracle of finding family when he'd thought himself forever alone in the world. But their reunion was interrupted by the thunder of approaching hooves as 2 riders emerged from the heat shimmer like harbingers of renewed conflict, dust clouds billowing behind them as they spurred their mounts toward the station. Deputy Frank Carson and Deputy Billy Walsh had been patrolling the territory south of Silver Creek when the sound of gunfire echoing across the desert had drawn their attention. Carson was a professional lawman in his 40s, his face weathered by years of frontier justice, and his eyes holding the hard competence of someone who had survived more gunfights than most men could count. His partner Walsh was younger, but equally dedicated to maintaining order through whatever means proved necessary, his hand already resting on his gun butt as they approached the scene of obvious violence. "What in hell happened here?" Carson demanded as he dismounted, his shotgun already in his hands and his eyes taking in the wounded Briggs, the scattered passengers, and Marshall kneeling beside the boy with the practiced assessment of a man accustomed to sorting truth from lies in the aftermath of violence. The scene told a story that seemed clear enough to the deputy's experienced eyes. An armed stranger had shot a railroad official and was now threatening a helpless child for reasons that would no doubt prove to be criminal in nature. The mathematics of frontier justice were brutally simple in such situations, and both lawmen prepared to act accordingly. "That drifter attacked me." Briggs gasped from where he lay clutching his shoulder, his face pale with shock and blood loss, but his voice still carrying the authority of his position. Pain and desperation gave his words an edge of conviction that was hard to dismiss. "Drew on me without provocation while I was maintaining lawful order. Nearly killed me in cold blood, and now he's got that boy as some kind of hostage." Carson's expression hardened as he processed the stationmaster's version of events, his professional instincts automatically siding with the established authority figure over the unknown drifter. From his perspective, he was looking at a clear case of criminal assault on a railroad official complicated by what appeared to be a kidnapping in progress. "Drop your weapon and step away from the boy." Carson ordered, his shotgun trained on Marshall's center mass with rock-steady precision. His voice carried the absolute authority of someone accustomed to instant obedience from those who found themselves on the wrong side of territorial law. "You're under arrest for assault on a railroad official and unlawful restraint of a minor child." "Now hold on just 1 minute," protested the elderly rancher Frank Sullivan, stepping forward despite his wife's desperate attempts to restrain him and keep him out of harm's way. His weathered face was flushed with indignation as he pointed an accusing finger at the wounded stationmaster. That man was protecting the child from abuse, not threatening him. "I saw the whole thing with my own eyes, and Briggs was the one who started the violence. I said, drop your gun." Carson barked, his finger tightening on the trigger as his patience ran out entirely. He'd seen too many situations escalate beyond control when civilians tried to interfere with law enforcement, and he wasn't about to let this one spiral into a massacre because some old rancher couldn't mind his own business. Marshall realized with growing desperation that the deputies saw only what Briggs wanted them to see: a dangerous drifter who had committed unprovoked violence against a respectable official and was now using an innocent child as a human shield. The truth about the stationmaster's cruelty, the boy's abandonment, and the miraculous discovery of his son would never be believed without proof he didn't have time to present. But now everything had changed in ways that transformed the entire situation from a simple matter of protecting an innocent child to something far more personal and desperate. This wasn't just about preventing injustice against a stranger. This was about saving his son, his flesh and blood, the miracle that Eliza's sacrifice had preserved through 10 years of separation and suffering. The knowledge that Thomas was his child transformed Marshall's desperation into something harder and more focused than mere survival instinct. Every protective instinct he possessed, every fragment of love that still remained in his battered heart, every lesson about honor and duty that his father had beaten into him with a leather strap, all of it crystallized into a single imperative: protect the boy at all costs. Billy's circle around behind him. Carson muttered to his partner, his voice pitched low, but still audible in the tense silence that had fallen over the platform. Don't let him use the boy as a shield, but be ready to take the shot if you get a clear angle. Marshall's mind raced through tactical possibilities as Walsh moved to flank him. On the younger deputy's movements, professional, and coordinated with his partners in a way that spoke of long experience working together. 2 lawmen with shotguns against 1 man with a pistol. The odds were grimly familiar from his sheriff days, but now he fought not just for his own life, but for his son's future. The freight train's whistle echoed in the distance, growing steadily louder as tons of rolling steel approached the station on schedule. Marshall calculated distances and timing with the desperate precision of someone whose world had just been rewritten by revelation, knowing that the approaching locomotive might offer their only chance of escape from a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. Listen to me. Marshall tried keeping his voice steady and reasonable, despite the chaos raging in his heart. That stationmaster was brutalizing this child for no reason other than spite and fear. I intervened to prevent further harm to someone who couldn't protect himself. Any decent man would have done the same thing. Save your lies for the territorial judge. Carson replied with the cold professionalism of someone who had heard every excuse and justification that criminals could devise. Briggs is a respected railroad employee with 20 years of faithful service. You're a drifter with a gun and blood on your hands. The choice between believing him or you isn't exactly difficult to make. The approaching train's whistle grew louder, its call cutting through the desert air like a promise of escape or a herald of doom, depending on how events unfolded in the next few minutes. Marshall could feel the vibrations beginning to reach them through the wooden platform, the massive weight of the locomotive and its trailing cars, creating tremors that spoke of unstoppable power and momentum. Time's up, mister. Carson announced with finality, his professional patience exhausted and his finger beginning to tighten on the trigger. Drop your weapon now, or we'll drop you where you stand. This is your last warning. Marshall's hand moved to his Colt in a motion as smooth as silk, drawn across steel years of practice and deadly necessity, combining in a draw that would have impressed even the legendary gunfighters whose names were whispered in saloons from Texas to California. But instead of engaging in a suicidal gunfight that would almost certainly result in Thomas being caught in the crossfire, he made a tactical decision that prioritized his son's safety over his own survival. He grabbed Thomas and rolled behind the nearest freight wagon as Carson's shotgun roared the heavy load of buckshot shredding the air where they'd been crouching and punching ragged holes in the wooden platform. Splinters flew like shrapnel, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air as Marshall pressed his son's face against his chest to protect him from the flying debris. "Stay down, Thomas." Marshall gasped, using his son's name for the first time, and feeling his heart swell with emotions he'd thought long dead. "No matter what happens, keep your head down and don't let go of me. We're getting out of this together." "I'm scared, Papa." The boy whispered the word, hitting Marshall like a physical blow, as he realized that Thomas had somehow known, had recognized him, despite their years of separation. The simple trust in that word, the acceptance and love it implied, gave him strength beyond his physical limitations. "I know, son." Marshall replied, his voice steady despite the bullets flying around them. "But I promise you this, I won't let anything happen to you. That's a father's oath, and I've never broken my word to anyone who mattered." Marshall rose from cover and fired over the wagon's edge, his bullet taking Carson in the leg with precision born of desperation and long practice. The deputy went down with a curse of pain and rage, but his partner immediately opened fire from the opposite angle, the shotgun blast splintering wood and sending fragments flying like deadly rain. The freight train thundered closer, its whistle now deafeningly loud, and its massive weight making the entire platform vibrate like a struck tuning fork. Marshall spotted what might be their salvation, a flat car loaded with lumber that offered handholds and the possibility of escape from the deadly crossfire that threatened to claim them both. But Carson, despite his wounded leg, had crawled behind cover and was reloading his weapon with the grim determination of a professional who refused to let pain interfere with duty. His next shot wasn't aimed directly at Marshall, but at the freight wagon sheltering Thomas, the heavy slug punching through the wooden side and missing the boy by mere inches. Marshall roared in fury and desperation, rising from cover to draw Carson's fire away from his son with complete disregard for his own safety. The deputy's second shot took him in the shoulder, the impact spinning him around and sending fire racing through his entire upper body. But Thomas remained unharmed behind the wagon. And that was all that mattered in a world that had suddenly contracted to contain only the two of them. Fighting through the pain that threatened to cloud his vision and weaken his gun hand, Marshall put another bullet into Carson's other leg, ensuring the deputy would stay down long enough for them to escape. Walsh, seeing his partner wounded and desperate to end the fight before it cost more blood, charged their position with the kind of courage that marked the difference between a peace officer and a common thug. "Now, Thomas," Marshall shouted, scooping his son up despite the agony in his shoulder and the way his wounded arm protested the additional weight. "Hold on tight and trust me, we're going for a ride." They ran alongside the moving train, Marshall's legs pumping despite the fire in his shoulder and the boy's weight in his arms, creating an awkward burden that threw off his natural rhythm. Walsh's shots kicked up dust around their feet as they sprinted for the flat car, one bullet coming close enough to tear through Marshall's vest without touching flesh. The lumber-loaded car was moving faster than a wounded man should have been able to run. But desperation and paternal love gave Marshall strength beyond his physical limitations. He leapt with every ounce of power remaining in his body, his good arm reaching for the wooden side of the car, while his wounded arm cradled Thomas against his chest with protective instinct that overrode pain. For a heart-stopping moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they hung in space with crushing death waiting on the rails below. Marshall's fingers caught the rough lumber splinters driving into his palm as the train's momentum jerked them forward with enough force to dislocate his shoulder if he hadn't been holding on with the grip of a desperate man. Thomas clung to his neck with surprising strength. For someone his size, his small body pressed tight against his father's chest. "I got you, Papa." The boy cried, his thin arms adding their strength to Marshall's failing grip in a gesture of trust and determination that brought tears to his father's eyes. "Don't let go, I won't let you fall." With a supreme effort of will that drew on reserves he hadn't known he possessed, Marshall hauled them both onto the flat car, collapsing onto the lumber pile, as Walsh's final shots sparked off the iron wheels below and echoed uselessly across the desert. They were safe together and free, wounded and exhausted, but alive and finally united after 10 years of separation that had nearly destroyed them both. Behind them, Silver Creek Station dwindled into the heat shimmer as the train carried them west toward whatever future awaited a father and son who had found each other against impossible odds. Marshall held Thomas close, using strips torn from his shirt to bandage his shoulder wound, while his son watched with wide, trusting eyes that reminded him so powerfully of Eliza that his breath caught in his throat. "Are you really my papa?" Thomas asked, his voice filled with wonder and hope that made Marshall's heart ache with emotions he'd thought buried forever. Marshall opened the locket again, showing the boy his mother's photograph, with hands that still trembled from pain and overwhelming emotion. The image seemed to glow in the desert sunlight, Eliza's smile as radiant and loving as he remembered from their brief time together. "Yes, son," he said, his voice steady with absolute conviction. "I'm your father, and I swear on your mother's memory that I'll never leave you again. We're family now, you and me, and families stick together no matter what the world throws at them." As the freight train rolled through the gathering dusk toward destinations unknown, father and son talked about the years they'd lost and the future they would build together from the ashes of separation and sorrow. Marshall learned that Eliza had taught school in a small town called Cedar Ridge until her death from fever the previous winter, that she'd raised Thomas with stories of his father's courage and honor, and that she'd spent her final breath hoping they would find each other before it was too late. "She used to show me your picture in that locket every night." Thomas revealed his small face, bright with memory, despite the exhaustion that lined his features. "She'd tell me stories about how brave you were, how you always stood up for people who couldn't protect themselves, and how someday when the danger was past, we'd be a real family like other children had. She said you were the best man she ever knew." The boy continued, "Even when you thought you were the worst. She said that's why she fell in love with you, because you cared more about doing right than being safe, and because you'd rather die than let innocent people suffer when you could help them." The words hit Marshall like revelation, reframing his decade of self-doubt and bitter wandering in a light that made his sacrifice seem less like failure and more like the foundation for redemption. Perhaps Eliza hadn't seen him as a man too dangerous to love, but as one too valuable to lose to his enemy's revenge. The train's rhythm was like a lullaby, carrying them toward hope and healing the steady clatter of wheels on rails, providing a counterpoint to their quiet conversation. Marshall thought about the choices that lay ahead, where to settle, whether to pin on a badge again in some quiet town where Thomas could grow up safe from the violence that had shaped his father's past, how to build a life worthy of Eliza's sacrifice. "I want to learn to ride horses," Thomas said suddenly, his voice bright with the eager anticipation of any 10-year-old boy dreaming of adventure and freedom. "Mama said you had the finest horses in all of Colorado, and that you could teach anyone to ride if they had the heart for it." Marshall smiled despite his pain, already envisioning a gentle mare with the patience to teach a determined boy that physical limitations didn't have to define the boundaries of possibility. "We'll find you a good horse, son. Just because your legs don't work the way other people's do doesn't mean you can't be a rider. Some of the best horsemen I've known started with challenges that made them more determined to succeed than folks who had everything handed to them. And I want to learn to shoot straight," Thomas added with the bloodthirsty enthusiasm that seemed to be bred into frontier children, regardless of their circumstances. "In case those bad men ever come looking for us again, or if we meet other people who hurt children like that stationmaster did." Marshall's expression grew serious as he considered the implications of his son's request. The world was indeed full of predators who preyed on the weak and innocent, and teaching Thomas to defend himself might prove essential to his survival. But there were lessons more important than marksmanship that needed to be passed along as well. "I'll teach you everything I know about guns and fighting and staying alive in a dangerous world," Marshall promised, his voice carrying the weight of paternal responsibility. "But remember what your mother taught you about right and wrong, about using strength to protect rather than to harm." We only draw our weapons to defend people who can't defend themselves, and violence should always be the last choice, never the first. Thomas nodded solemnly, his young face grave, with understanding that spoke of hard lessons learned during his brief but difficult life. Mama said you were a peace officer because you wanted to make the world safer for regular folks. She said that's what made you different from the bad men you fought to protect, not to hurt. Miles behind them as the evening shadows lengthened across Silver Creek Station, and the desert began its nightly transformation from furnace to icebox. A different drama was unfolding that would provide closure to the day's violent events. Judge Harlan Morrison had arrived on schedule to find the platform splattered with blood, his old enemy Jeremiah Briggs wounded and ranting about armed desperados, and 2 deputies nursing bullet wounds while spinning increasingly elaborate tales of unprovoked assault. But Morrison was a fair man despite his personal grudges, and he had learned long ago to distrust initial reports of frontier violence until all witnesses had been heard. The elderly rancher Frank Sullivan and several other passengers stepped forward to offer testimony that painted a very different picture of the day's events, their accounts revealing Briggs' brutal treatment of a disabled child and Marshall's heroic intervention on behalf of someone who couldn't protect himself. The judge's investigation was thorough and professional, his questions designed to separate truth from fiction in the way that only long experience with frontier justice could provide. Witness after witness confirmed that Briggs had initiated the violence through his unprovoked assault on Thomas, that Marshall had acted purely in defense of an innocent child, and that the deputies had arrived after the fact with incomplete information that led them to draw incorrect conclusions about the situation. Stationmaster Briggs was terminated immediately and faced criminal charges for child endangerment assault and abuse of his official authority. The deputies, whose excessive use of force had been witnessed by a platform full of passengers, were suspended pending a full investigation that would likely end their careers in law enforcement. Justice delayed, but not denied, had finally come to Silver Creek Station in the form of a judge who valued truth over convenient lies. Meanwhile, the freight train rolled on through star-filled darkness, carrying father and son toward whatever destiny awaited them in the vast territories ahead. Marshall Wade, who had spent 10 years believing himself unworthy of love or family, held his child close and felt the hollow places in his soul beginning to fill with purpose and hope that he'd thought lost forever. "Iyo, where are we going, Papa?" Thomas asked sleepily, his small body finally beginning to relax after days of fear and uncertainty. "Home, son," Marshall replied, his voice steady with newfound certainty and strength. "We're going home to build the life your mother dreamed we could have together." The boy's breathing grew deep and regular as he fell asleep in his father's arms, finally safe after an ordeal that would have broken many adults, but had only strengthened his quiet courage. Marshall looked up at the vast canopy of stars that stretched from horizon to horizon, the same stars Eliza had used to teach their son about wonder and possibility during the lonely years of their separation, and whispered a prayer of gratitude for the woman who had sacrificed everything to preserve this moment. "I'll take care of him." He promised her memory, his words carried away by the desert wind, but heard he hoped by whatever remained of the love they'd shared. "I'll give him the life you dreamed he could have, and I'll make sure he knows every day how much you loved us both." The train rolled on toward tomorrow, carrying them both toward a future bright with promise and redemption, while behind them the desert wind erased their tracks from the sand, leaving no trace of their passage except the echoes of justice finally served and love finally found after 10 years of wandering in the wilderness of grief and regret. Marshall Wade was finally going home, not to a place, but to a purpose that would define the rest of his days and give meaning to all the pain that had brought them to this moment of grace.